Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two creepy cases that were initially unsolved, but very slowly pieces began to be discovered, and when the truth was finally learned, each was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. And now more than ever, although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. On a hot August day in 1979, the phone rang at a sheriff's office in Idaho and Earl Holdom picked it up. On the other end of the line was dispatch, which had just received a strange report about a suspicious bag found by a family of artifact hunters who were spending the afternoon searching for arrowheads. The bag, which appeared to the family to be an old burlap sack, was stumbled upon inside Buffalo Cave, about 100 miles to the west of the Idaho city of Dubois. After hanging up the phone, Earl grabbed his hat and headed out to his patrol vehicle to begin the journey to Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve, where Buffalo Cave is located. When he arrived, he was led to the cave by the family and got his first look at the bag, which was found inside a shallow hole. Without disturbing it too much, Earl had a look inside and noticed tatters of clothing and a reddish-brown object that was difficult to discern at first. When he finally realized what he was probably looking at, he had no idea just how improbable a story the item would end up telling. A search of the bag's surroundings found nothing more, and after the bag had been photographed and documented at the scene, it was transported to the medical examiner's office in Clark County. At the scene, the coroner determined that inside the burlap sack was a headless, limbless human torso, which was little more than a pelvic bone and a set of vertebrae. And after a thorough examination in the office, he came to several conclusions about these strange set of human remains. First was that they belonged to a 25 to 45-year-old white male who stood between 5'5" and 6'1" and had reddish-brown hair. Second was that the man had been wearing a maroon sweater, a white collared shirt with blue pinstripes, and a pair of black pants when he died. And 3, he had been killed and literally taken apart afterward, sometime between 1969 and the body being discovered. Based on the examination, a few further assumptions could be made. The death likely occurred at a different location than where the body was dumped inside Buffalo Cave, and the taking apart was a gruesome affair, although that conclusion didn't take much to come to. The marks on the torso showed that multiple methods and tools were used to remove the head and limbs. The arm and leg bones also weren't separated at the joints, instead both sharp and blunt objects were used to separate at the midpoints. And finally, the vertebrae in the neck showed signs of contact with a sharp object of some kind, which more than likely resulted in the removal of the head. In the initial stages, there seemed to be a lot for police to go on, but in truth, the case went nowhere fast. Without a head, identification of the individual the torso belonged to was impossible at the time. And not only that, Earl disagreed with the coroner's findings based on the clothing he saw inside the sack. They didn't appear to be the type of clothes someone in the late 60s or early 70s would be wearing. To him, they resembled something a gambler from the early 1900s would wear. And unfortunately, although news broke of the torso's discovery, few leads came in, and those that did were quickly ruled out as possibilities. The case of the Buffalo Cave torso, as it became known, went cold for more than a decade until a girl exploring the cave discovered a skeletal hand in 1991. This sparked police into further action at Buffalo Cave, and a more extensive search and excavation took place to see if more parts belonging to the torso could be found. And sure enough, the remnants of the victim's arms and legs were located and discovered to be well preserved, all things considered. There was even some skin still attached to some of the bones. Unfortunately, there was nothing to fingerprint, however, as the fingers were completely decomposed down to the bone, so once again, despite a solid discovery, police were left wondering who it was they found in Buffalo Cave. Another 6 years would pass before the sheriff's department would ask for assistance from the Idaho State University Anthropology Department. The remains were then transported there and work got underway to uncover the identity of the torso, but anthropologists had little to no luck making any headway in the case either. It wouldn't be until 2015 when another extensive search and excavation took place inside the cave in a concerted effort to locate the missing head, but even to this day it has never been found. So, identification seemed completely unlikely and the headless remains were stored away in a secure lab for another few years. With the rise in popularity a few years later of consumer DNA tests came a new opportunity for the Idaho State University team. In more recent years, DNA testing has become a critical tool for people who piece together family trees. And what police have discovered is that this same approach can be used to solve cold cases, as a variety of websites now have large DNA databases to compare samples to. It's a somewhat controversial method, but one that has solved high-profile cold cases, like that of the infamous Golden State Killer. So in early 2019, the anthropology department at Idaho State University reached out to the DNA Doe Project, which is a non-profit organization that specializes in uncovering identities using the same genealogical methods. A sample was then obtained from the Buffalo Cave torso, and once a solid profile had been obtained, the results were returned to the DNA Doe Project in July and research began. Finally, on October 28, 2019, the team was confident they had found their man. What they discovered was that the man the torso belonged to still had a living grandchild who was an 87-year-old man living in California. He was then contacted and agreed to have his DNA sample taken to confirm his relation to the man the Buffalo Cave torso belonged to. When it did, the DNA profile from the suspected grandson was found to be a 100% match for a grandfather-grandchild relationship. And with that, the torso was then confirmed to belong to Joseph Henry Loveless, and he was not a gambler who was killed between 1969 and 1979. His murder instead took place in 1916, and while this may seem like the ending to a decades-long mystery, things were only just starting to get interesting. Joseph Henry Loveless was born on December 3, 1870, in what was then called the Utah Territory in a town called Payson. His father was from Indiana and his mother was from Massachusetts, and while it's unclear how they met, they were both early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who are also known as Mormons. As such, they were also pioneers who moved out to the Utah Territory to settle and practice their religion unfettered. Because of their religious beliefs, however, it would be much more difficult to identify Joseph. This is because Utah pioneers practice endogamy, which is a practice of only marrying within the local community, but at the same time they practice polygamy, which is the custom of having more than one spouse at a time. As a result of both, Joseph's lineage produced many half-relationships, and according to the DNA Doe Project, one grandparent can produce hundreds of first cousins. And so once genealogists determined Joseph's identity and began more direct research on his life, they found way more than they bargained for. As it turned out, Joseph was an outlaw who lived in a tent on the outskirts of the city during his final days of life, and he was on the run for a very good reason. Much earlier in his life, when Joseph was 28, he married a woman named Harriet Jane Savage of Salt Lake City. It was almost unheard of in those days, but just less than 5 years later, Harriet was granted a divorce from Joseph after he essentially abandoned the family and refused to support the child they had together. Rather quickly, a little more than a year later, Joseph remarried, this time to a woman named Agnes Octavia Caldwell of Bear Lake County, Idaho. Between 1906 and 1913, the couple had 4 children, which Joseph actually did support, but through unsavory means. Joseph got into bootlegging, which was the process of illegally trafficking liquor, and he was first arrested for the crime in March of 1914 in Burley, Idaho. Before the year was out, he was arrested a second time for the same crime, only this time he quickly escaped jail by cutting through the bars of his jail cell with a saw he hid in his boot. Apparently, after his first arrest, he learned to always be prepared in case he got caught. By then, he was wanted on several liquor-related charges and escaping custody, so manhunt got underway, but Joseph would remain on the run for 15 months before police caught up with him again. This time, however, he was arrested under the name Walter Guerin. Part of what made him difficult to keep track of was that police at the time were only casually aware of the lengths Joseph went to in order to hide his real identity. This is because he used many different aliases, particularly with the first name of Walter. And in addition to Guerin, his last names included Cairns, Curran, Currans, and Kernans. Other times, he'd go by the name Charles Smith, leading many to believe that his second wife, Agnes, was also involved in his unsavory activity, as she was known to use the alias Ada Smith when she went into town. In any case, their relationship would come to a horrific end in early May of 1916. Neighbors of the family said that they heard fighting coming from the house one night, and the next morning, Agnes was found in pieces from what looked to be an attack with an axe, and Joseph was nowhere to be found. Newspapers then rushed to cover the murder, and the suspect police were looking for was listed as Charles Smith. While the search was going on, a funeral was held for Agnes, which was also covered by newspapers, and apparently, after overhearing one of Joseph's children, a reporter wrote that the child said that his papa never stayed in jail for very long and that he'd be out soon. 2 days later, those words proved prophetic, as Joseph was both caught and escaped from jail once again. Also, as a quick aside, because of all the aliases, it's not clear if he was being jailed as the same man or as each of the individual aliases. Because of how long ago this happened, some of the sources are also a little vague. Whatever the case, he apparently waited for 5:30 p.m. to roll around, which was when all the guards sat down together for dinner. While they ate, Joseph once again produced a saw from his boot and cut his way to freedom. This, however, would be the last time anyone would see Joseph alive. A wanted poster was then circulated after his escape, calling for the capture of Walt Cairns, said to last be wearing a maroon sweater, light-colored hat, brown coat, and black trousers. Because the clothing found on his body was so similar to what was being reported in the wanted poster, authorities believe that Joseph met his end rather quickly after being caught. It's been speculated that Joseph was killed by his dead wife's family members who were seeking revenge, but that theory is yet to be confirmed. Based on how horrific his body was found though, it seems that whoever did it intended for it to be gruesome, giving some credence to the idea that it was for revenge. But either way, almost 110 years after his death, there are still some parts of Joseph's story that haven't been uncovered. Covering nearly 10,000 acres in the Australian state of New South Wales, the Belanglo State Forest is a dense reforested area that includes some of the earliest radiata pines in the area, planted there in 1919. It's located about an hour from Sydney, and its beauty has made it a popular recreation area for both tourists and native Australians alike. That beauty, however, is contrasted with something a little more sinister. The Belanglo State Forest has earned a reputation as a dumping ground for murderers, most notably serial offender Ivan Milat, who, as you may remember, was convicted of killing 7 backpackers there in the 1980s and 90s. Ivan dispatched his victims in a variety of cruel ways, including using one as target practice. By August 29, 2010, the backpacker murders, as the crimes became known, were a distant memory as several men were spending the day dirt biking around Belanglo. As they rounded a corner along the trail, the lead biker suddenly skidded to a halt, bringing the ride to an abrupt stop for those with him. The others were confused initially until they looked at what the lead rider was stooping over to get a better view of. Scattered around the base of several trees were the skeletal remains and tattered clothing belonging to a woman with her shirt emblazoned with the word angelic. The riders immediately notified authorities, and police were soon on the scene to investigate and document the remains. And among them was Clive Small, the detective who caught the backpacker murderer, and he couldn't help but wonder if the man he captured more than a decade earlier could be responsible for more. An examination of the remains, however, would determine that the woman they belonged to was murdered much more recently, and Ivan was already well into his lifetime prison sentence. This could only mean that there was another murderer at work. When news broke of the remains, police had very little to go on initially, particularly as it pertained to the woman's identity. During a news conference, they simply referred to her as Angel, which was a reference to the shirt she was wearing at the time of her murder. For 5 years afterward, Angel's remains would stay stowed in a forensic lab drawer, unidentified and unclaimed, until one day a mysterious finding was made almost 750 miles or 1,200 kilometers away years later. Carly Pierce Stevenson was a 20-year-old single mother who was described as having a heart of gold. She grew up in a loving, close-knit family, and she ensured that the same was provided to her daughter, 2-year-old Candace Pierce, who was affectionately known as Candles. Carly and Candace lived in Alice Springs in the Northwest Territory, surrounded by doting friends and loved ones. And if Carly had any flaws at all, it's that she was too quick to trust others and saw the good in everyone. In 2008, Carly met a man named Daniel Holdom, who was quite a bit older than her at 33 years old. Despite the age difference though, Daniel swept Carly off her feet, and soon the pair were dating exclusively to the point where Carly started to introduce him to her friends. It seemed like Carly had finally found a partner she could depend on to provide for her and help raise Candace, but there was something off about Daniel that one of her friends, Tanya, picked up on right away. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but from the start she didn't like him, although she kept this feeling to herself, seeing how happy Carly seemed. And all of this made it even more of a shock when one day in November 2008, Carly's friends and family learned that she and Daniel had left Alice Springs suddenly to look for work elsewhere. In the past, Carly had mentioned wanting to leave Alice Springs, but it wasn't like her to just disappear without saying goodbye. But either way, about a week after Carly and Daniel left Alice Springs, Tanya's phone rang with Carly on the other line in tears. She then went on to explain that she was having regrets about leaving and missed her family very much. It sounded to Tanya like Carly wanted to come home, so Tanya offered to book her a plane ticket or come pick her up, but Carly refused. When the two friends hung up the call that day, it would be the last time they ever spoke. After months of hearing nothing from Carly and having no idea where in the world she might be, Tanya and her mother went to the local police station and filed a missing persons report. Detectives then began working the case and were quickly able to get Daniel on the phone, and just reaching him gave police the impression that they could find a fast conclusion to the case. But he actually went on to tell them that Carly left with Candace and headed to Queensland to start a new life, and he was no longer in touch with them. He also added that Carly didn't want to communicate with her family anymore, which was even more startling to her loved ones. That wasn't the Carly they knew, but her mother decided to respect her daughter's wishes anyway, and the missing persons file was closed. But in fact, regardless of Daniel's claims, Carly would actually sporadically reach out to the family and friends through the middle of 2011, but this was usually only to ask for money. Out of love for Carly and the desire to help her get on her feet in her new life though, her loved ones transferred money whenever she requested it. They were all just thankful to hear from her, even if infrequently, because it let them know that Carly was at least alive and well. In truth, however, Carly was neither, but it would take years and a chance finding before the story of what happened to her and Candace began to become clear. In 2015, while driving down the Karoonda Highway near the small town of Winarka in South Australia, a motorist spotted something along the side of the road that got his interest. He pressed the brake on his truck and slowly pulled off to the shoulder before getting out and walking toward it. As he approached, he recognized it as a carry-on suitcase that someone had abandoned or lost along the highway, but it looked like it had been sitting there for a while, maybe even years. He then bent over and grabbed the zipper, slowly pulling at it and revealing what might be inside. As he flipped it open, he was horrified by the sight. Inside were a tiny set of skeletonized human remains. Sometime later, medical examiners and a forensics team got to work trying to uncover the child's identity and learn how she ended up in a suitcase along the side of a remote stretch of highway. Then, using the skull, a facial reconstruction was created, but when it was checked against a database of missing children, no match was found. So after getting nowhere, investigators held a news conference and appealed to the public for any information that might lead to the girl's identity. While watching the news one day, Tanya saw a report on the body's discovery which included images of the clothing the child was wearing. And immediately, a dreadful feeling came over her as she watched, and when her husband walked in the room, she was almost in tears as she told him she recognized the clothing as belonging to Candace. But either way, despite being shaken by what she had just seen, Tanya picked up the phone and called the Crime Stoppers number that accompanied the report. More than 1,200 calls came in with information in response to the broadcast, but it was Tanya's that broke the case open. Using a DNA profile obtained from the remains, the forensics team ran it against a national database and they got a hit. There was undoubtedly a mother-daughter relationship between the child's skeleton and the woman known as Angel, who was found in the Belanglo State Forest. Thanks to Tanya's phone call providing police with Candace's name, authorities were able to identify the bodies found hundreds of miles away from each other as Carly and Candace. This provided a spark to each investigation, and during interviews with family members, police learned about how the mother and daughter abruptly departed Alice Springs with Daniel. And naturally, this put him at the top of the list of persons of interest in the case. As they start to dig into his background, police discovered a trend of alarming behavior. In 1999, Daniel was arrested after sneaking into a woman's room and attempting to kill her with a pillow wrapped in duct tape. He was convicted the following year, but when he got out of prison, he began stalking her again. And that's not all. Police also learned of something far worse. In 2013, so several years after the disappearance of Carly and Candace, he was arrested and convicted of assaulting an 8-year-old in a caravan park. At the point that he became a prime suspect in the disappearance, he was actually still in custody, so police could take their time and build a solid case against him. But thankfully, they didn't need long. Here's what was determined. In September of 2008, Daniel was driving a vehicle along the Stewart Highway near Alice Springs with his then-girlfriend Hazel and her 2 children. Suddenly, the car skidded off the road and tumbled several times, and while Daniel was relatively unharmed, the accident paralyzed Hazel from the waist down and killed her 2 children. While Hazel was recovering in the hospital, Daniel and Carly's paths crossed and the two began a relationship. Of course, Daniel didn't tell Carly and Hazel about one another, so while in Alice Springs, Daniel began leading a double life. In November, he then convinced Carly to run away with him, which she reluctantly agreed to. Then from Alice Springs, they traveled as far north as Darwin and as far south as Adelaide, where they stopped and stayed at various motels and caravan parks. On December 14, 2008, Daniel drove them to the Belanglo State Park, where he assaulted and killed Carly before taking Candace and traveling hundreds of miles over the next 4 or 5 days. At some point during this, he also got rid of her, put her body in a suitcase, and dumped her along the highway. Following these incidents and upon Hazel's release from the hospital, she happened to find Carly's personal papers in the car and immediately accused Daniel of having an affair, which was certainly the case. And along with her papers was Carly's cell phone, which Daniel then used in the years following to give her family the impression that everything was fine and to solicit money from them. At some point, Daniel even got Hazel into his scheme, getting her to pose as Carly to make several transactions in at least 4 different states and territories in Australia. Together, they managed to extort upwards of $100,000 from Carly's distraught family before all contact ceased in 2011. Hazel contends that her involvement in the scheme to extort money from Carly's family was out of fear of Daniel and not a willingness to participate. But either way, after Carly and Candace's remains were identified on October 21, 2015, police needed just 1 week before he was charged in Carly's murder. It would then take another several months before he was officially charged with the murder of Candace. Daniel, however, maintained his innocence. During the period between his being charged with the murders and 2018, the court system had a suppression order placed on the evidence of the case, meaning the details of the murder and the level of Daniel's depravity were unknown to the public until the order was lifted. When it was, it sent shockwaves throughout the country. It was then learned that when Daniel reached a remote section of the Belanglo State Forest on December 14, 2008, the couple exited the car and a ruthless attack on Carly began that included a glass bottle. After the assault and after she had passed, before he departed the forest, Daniel pulled out a camera and filled an SD memory card with photos of Carly, obviously reveling in what he had done. When he was finished, he left her where she was and went to retrieve Candace from where the couple was living in the Australian Capital Territory. Over the next few horrifying days, Daniel likely did something similar a number of times while traveling to South Australia with Candace. And at some point, 4 or 5 days after he killed Carly, he also did the same with Candace at a motel in the New South Wales town of Narrandera. When she was finally gone, he placed her in the suitcase and tossed it out of his vehicle on a remote stretch of highway hundreds of miles away from where her mother would be found. In the end, Daniel's motive for getting rid of Carly was supposedly just to get his hands on Candace. Daniel's trial was set to begin in August of 2018, but just a week before, he finally confessed the murders. At the New South Wales Supreme Court on November 30th, 2018, Daniel was convicted and sentenced to 2 life sentences, and during the hearing, Carly's father Bruce represented the family and read a prepared statement with Daniel present. In it, Bruce told the court that he had never hated anyone the way he hates Daniel, and that just the thought of what he did to his daughter and grandchild produced so much anger that it made it difficult to breathe sometimes. He added that even the death penalty wouldn't be enough of a punishment for his crimes, but this option was never on the table as the death penalty was abolished in 1955 in New South Wales. Throughout the emotional statement, Daniel sat in court completely stoic with his arms crossed. In several handwritten letters Daniel wrote from his prison cell, he avoided personal responsibility for the murders and pointed the finger for his crimes on a horrible childhood, saying that he was the victim of constant physicality with fists, belts, and wood by his parents. He even alleged that his head would be rammed into cupboard doors, and these incidents caused him to run away several times, only for police to return him to his parents when he was found. He would also go on to say that when the car accident occurred in 2008 that left Hazel wheelchair-bound and her children dead, Daniel said it turned his life upside down and he turned to drugs. He claimed to have made several failed attempts on himself before he ended up with Carly and Candace. Daniel is still serving his life sentences in an Australian prison. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. In case you didn't know already, if you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.